Hello, and welcome to this week's mini lesson focused on text structure, how authors create different plot structures by manipulating time. Why do we bother looking at this? Why do we bother looking at text structure and how authors tell their stories? Well, unlike last week when we were thinking about what the story was about, like the big ideas and the topics and the messages that they were trying to communicate through their themes, thinking about text structure is more thinking about how the author is building their story. And doing that can make us appreciate the techniques that they use to make their stories more interesting. There are, even if you're telling the same story, there are good ways to tell that story and bad ways to tell that story, or maybe not bad ways, but more interesting ways and less interesting ways to tell your story. I think we can all think of a time when we've heard a story that was just really boring compared to someone who maybe could tell it better in a more entertaining way. And plot structure has a lot to do with things being more entertaining or less entertaining. So here are the types of plot structure, again, all having to do with how the author is telling their story with time. The most common form of plot structure is linear or chronological. This is where time just moves in a straight line from the beginning of the story to the middle through the end without any interruptions. In parallel structure, there are actually two or more related stories that are happening at the same time. Oftentimes, this happens like bouncing back and forth chapter to chapter between two different characters' perspectives. The next one is nonlinear or fractured. This one is not very common, and it's probably the most complicated. It's when an author chooses to just jump around through time, sometimes recalling memories, sometimes just chopping up different pieces of a story and giving them to you almost as little excerpts. Finally, circular storytelling. This is when the story begins sometimes at the most exciting moment of the story, and then we get a long flashback that tells us how we got to that moment before returning to that moment and seeing the conclusion. Here's what these look like in a more visual way. So a linear story has the beginning, middle, end, starting with exposition, the beginning of a story, introducing a conflict, moving forward, we get the rising action, climax, turning point, falling action, and resolution, all in one neat line. Parallel structure has two characters or more characters that are experiencing related things at the same time. There's usually interaction or connection between the characters. Like maybe it's two kids that go to the same school, and we hear one person's side of the story and then another person's side of the story. Nonlinear or fragmented is just kind of all over the place. I read a book recently that had a nonlinear narrative structure, and it's hard to read because you're not quite sure where things fit in. But it is kind of the way that memory works sometimes, where if you're telling a story, you're like, remember another part of that story, and you tell that piece, and it's all kind of jumbled and out of order. Here's my little diagram for circular structure, starting at the beginning of a story, and then, let's figure out how we got here. Long flashback in the middle, and then the end winds up back where the beginning started, and we find out what happens. All right, here's some examples. Most stories, as I said, follow a linear structure of some kind. If you think of watching a movie, most of the movies or TV shows you watch probably go straight through time. But I bet you can come up with some examples of shows or movies that don't do that. Superhuman, which you read at the beginning of class together, is a good example of circular structure. Let me show you what I mean. Remember that at the beginning of Superhuman, we see X and Sarita like on the roof, but we don't know how they got there. We don't know why they're there. It's just throwing us right in the action. And then we get these flashbacks 3 days ago. And we find out more about the background, why they're there, what happened, until boom, then we're back on the roof where we started the story. So that completed the little circle there. And then from there, there's a couple different kind of flashbacks, but it's mostly linear from there. So that's an example of circular structure, at least at the beginning of that story. A Private Experience, which we read last week, is mostly linear, following Chica and the woman as they go through that riot. But it has some nonlinear elements as well, with those flash forwards where it said like later Chica will, and anytime you see like words like later or 3 days ago, that's really what you're looking for to notice these shifts in time. Long Way Down is another interesting example structurally. It's mostly linear too, in a way, because it tells the story of Will from right after his brother died or was shot through his elevator ride down. And that's just kind of a straight line. But obviously, there's tons of flashbacks, and each of those elevator rides is kind of like a circle where it starts with the person coming in the elevator with Will, and then we get a long flashback of who they are and how they're connected, and then it ends with them on the elevator again too. So really interesting structure going on in Long Way Down. So how do you identify these plot structures? Like I said, you're looking for those words that let you notice how the author is changing time around in the story. And once you pick up on those things, you can ask yourself, is it moving straight through time? Is it jumping around? And if it's jumping around, look for patterns in what you are noticing. Patterns in how they're manipulating time, and thinking about what of our four plot structures it fits in best. This week, you're going to practice this kind of plot structure thing by reading a short story called Indian Education by Sherman Alexie. I don't have that pulled up, but it's like a 5 or 6 page short true story memoir of the author's experience. And I think you'll see that he's using time in interesting ways in that story too. All right, you can move on to the next assignment, which just asks you to submit a Google form checking that you understand some of what I talked about here. The key idea to focus on for that is these types of plot structure, knowing what is what. Let me know if you have any questions, and good luck with this week's assignments.